During the 19th century, a serial killer stalked the streets of London. The brutality of the murders sent shockwaves around the world that still resonates today. When night fell, women were brutally murdered in the streets, their organs removed, their faces and bodies mutilated, all carried out under the cover of darkness. The killer was never caught and seemed to have the ability to disappear at will, leading to speculations that the murderer was supernatural. To this day, the murders remain unsolved. Join us as we discuss the terrifying mystery of Jack the Ripper. Imagine you're walking down the streets of Victorian London at night. The cobbled streets are dimly lit by the flickering of gas lamps, casting ghostly shadows that seem to follow you down the lonely road. Smog hangs thick in the air, making visibility even more difficult. When you left to see your friend this evening, you'd almost forgotten about the murders reported in the newspapers. But as you turn into a dark, lonely alleyway, it's suddenly all you can think about. That's when you hear it. The sound of someone else's footsteps following behind you, but you can't be sure. You stop walking and listen, but you hear nothing. You slowly look around and see the alley is clear. You convince yourself that you're just being paranoid, but something somewhere in the back of your mind is screaming at you to run. You carry on walking, faster now, your heart pounding against your chest. Then you hear the footsteps again. They're getting closer, louder. As you glance back over your shoulder, you stumble over one of the uneven cobbles in the street and fall heavily on the ground. You try to catch your breath as you lay winded on the ground, but instead, you release a low moan of fear as the dark shadow of a looming presence stands over you. Before you can say anything, you feel the cold blade of a knife pressed against your throat. The next day, your friend is reading the newspaper, and they see a now familiar headline: Jack the Ripper strikes again. But under the headline is something even more familiar. It's a photo of his most recent victim. A photo of someone they immediately recognise as you. What made the murders of Jack the Ripper so shocking is that there had never been anything quite like it before. Of course, there had been murders, but never before had there been a series of reported murders that could so clearly be attributed to one person. A new term would be invented to describe the series of killings: serial killings. Thus, Jack the Ripper became the world's first recognised serial killer. But it wasn't just being the first serial killer that sealed his infamy. It was the nature of his murders that shocked and terrified his Victorian contemporaries. The brutality with which he killed his victims was on a level never seen before and rarely seen since. And the fact he was never caught has captured the fear and imagination of people to this day. It was 3:40 in the morning on Friday the 31st of August, 1888, when cart driver George Cross was walking along Bucks Row on his way to work when he saw what he initially thought to be tarpaulin. But as he drew nearer, he saw it was a woman lying on her back. He called out for help from a passerby, and he and another man found a policeman to inform of their grim discovery. Shortly after they left, the body was discovered by PC John Neal, who upon closer inspection by the light of his lamp found that the woman's throat had been cut. She had only died half an hour before being discovered. The brutality in which she had been murdered wasn't appreciated until her autopsy. Her throat was severed by 2 deep cuts, one of which completely severed all tissue down to the vertebrae. There were several abdominal injuries, including one gash from the left side of the lower abdomen all the way up to the sternum, leaving the intestine exposed, in addition to which her genitals had been stabbed twice. The coroner concluded that the murderer must have had some rough anatomical knowledge and that the wounds would have been the work of a single killer. The victim would be identified as that of Mary Ann Nichols, otherwise known as Polly. Despite the short time period separating the murder and discovery of the body, and there being at least 4 potential witnesses within a short distance of where the murder took place, no one had seen or heard anything suspicious. This would be just the start of the killer's reign of terror that would last a horrifying 12 weeks in 1888, but would reverberate all the way to the present day. It was 1:35 a.m. on the 8th of September 1888, and Annie Chapman had returned to her lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, and while eating a baked potato, she was asked to pay for her bed for the night. She explained to the manager that she had no money, but promised to return with the money shortly, and begged him to keep the bed for her. The last time he saw her, she was walking towards Spitalfields Market. At 5:30 a.m, Annie is seen with a man outside 29 Hanbury Street by a witness of the name of Elizabeth Long. She overheard the man asking, "Will you?" To which Annie replies, "Yes." The man had his back to Long, so she was unable to see his face, but she recognised the woman as Annie Chapman, who was facing towards her. 10 minutes later, Albert Kadosh, a resident of 27 Hanbury Street, which was directly next door to 29 Hanbury Street, was walking out into his backyard when he heard a noise from the yard next door behind the fence. He hears voices, but the only word he can make out is a woman saying no. He then heard something falling against the fence. 20 minutes later, the mutilated body of Annie Chapman is found in that very backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. It's extremely likely that Albert Kadosh had heard the last words of Annie Chapman begging for her life. As with the case of Polly Nichols, Annie's throat was severed by 2 deep cuts, but the level of mutilation was well in excess of what Polly had suffered. Annie's abdomen had been entirely cut open. Her small intestine was placed above her right shoulder, and her uterus, as well as sections of her bladder and genitals, had been removed. The expertise with which these had been removed led the coroner to state that this was the work of somebody with great anatomical knowledge. Strangely, he noted that, while he was certain Polly had entered the yard alive, there were no signs of a struggle. He concluded that even an experienced surgeon would require the best part of an hour to perform the injuries and extractions of organs, which left the question, how was the murderer able to kill and mutilate Annie Chapman with such inhuman speed? The early hours of the 30th of September 1888 heralded an incident that would cement Jack the Ripper's infamy. What came next would come to be known as the double event. The body of Elizabeth Stride was discovered in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street at approximately 1 a.m. Her throat had been cut, and an attempt had been made to cut off her ear, but no other slashes or incisions had been made. The reasons why would soon become clear. The autopsy concluded that the lack of blood spatter showed that, strangely, Elizabeth was standing up when her throat was cut, and like with the previous victim, Polly Nichols, she didn't put up a fight. This was despite there being no sedatives such as alcohol, anesthetics or narcotics found in her stomach. The blood around the body at the scene of the murder was still wet, which meant that either Jack the Ripper had heard the truck and pony driver approach and was interrupted before he could begin the mutilation, or more unsettlingly, he was hiding in the shadows of the yard, watching his fourth murder victim being discovered. Jack was clearly angry at being interrupted that night and took this out on his second victim of the night, Catherine Eddowes. Just 45 minutes after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes' mutilated body was discovered in Mitre Square. Of all the Ripper victims up to this point, Catherine Eddowes' body had suffered more mutilation than any of the others. Her throat was cut in the same manner as all the other victims, but she'd been disemboweled. Her intestines were placed over her right shoulder, and an additional 2 foot of intestine had been removed from the body and placed between Eddowes' body and arm. The mutilation was not only restricted to the body, her face was also mutilated in a bizarre fashion. A triangular flap was peeled from the skin of each cheek, with tips pointing towards the eyes that some have said look like arrows. There are also cuts made to her eyelids, including one that was about 1.5 inches long to the left eye. During the autopsy, it was discovered that her left kidney had been cleanly removed, as well as her uterus. Catherine Eddowes had been positively identified as speaking with a man at 1:35 a.m. Her body would be discovered by PC Watkins at 1:45 a.m. This meant that Jack the Ripper had killed her, removed her kidney and uterus, disemboweled her, and mutilated her body and face, all in under 10 minutes, while in the dark, without being seen or heard. It was like some inhuman, evil force of inconceivable murderous speed and efficiency was stalking in the East End of London after dark. The murder of Catherine Eddowes would present another first, the first and arguably only clue left by the killer. A piece of Eddowes' bloodied apron was found at the entrance to a tenement in Goulston Street, Whitechapel, at 2:55 a.m. There was a chalk inscription on the wall directly above the apron. It read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." It was impossible to know what the message meant, whether it was the killer somehow blaming the Jews for his actions, or if the apron was accidentally dropped under the graffito. Such graffiti were commonplace in that area of Whitechapel. The alternative is that Jack the Ripper intentionally placed the apron under the graffito to create more confusion as part of his game. Jack the Ripper's penchant for games would become clear in the coming days. The following day, on the 1st of October, the Central News Agency released a letter they had received on the 29th of September claiming to be from the killer. The letter was initially dismissed as a hoax, but it was taken more seriously following the double events, particularly as it looked like the murderer had attempted to remove Elizabeth Stride's ear, as promised in the letter. The letter was titled Dear Boss, and would come to be known as the Dear Boss letter. In the letter he posted about killing his last victim, which at the time was Polly Nichols, with such speed that she didn't have time to squeal. An eerily accurate portrayal of the coroner's assessment of Polly being killed before she had time to react. He went on to say how much he loves his work and can't wait to kill again, and promises that they will soon hear more of him and his funny little games. Finally, he signs off as Jack the Ripper, christening himself with a name that remains immortalised to this day. The same day, the Central News Agency received another correspondence, this time in the form of a postcard. The writer references the earlier Dear Boss letter, and it tells the reader they will be hearing about a double event, as the killer was interrupted and prevented from moving the ears of his first victim that evening. What makes a compelling argument for this being from the killer is that it referenced the double event before it was described by the press. Once more, it was signed Jack the Ripper. It wasn't understood why the killer had been removing body parts until George Lusk received a package on the 16th of October. Contained within the package was half a human kidney and a note that was addressed from hell. The note read, "Mr. Lusk, Sir, I send you half a kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." Medical reports carried out by Dr. Openshaw found the kidney to be very similar to the one removed from Catherine Eddowes. On the morning of the 9th of November, Jack the Ripper committed his final and most heinous murder. The mutilations he had carried out in his previous murders paled in comparison to the atrocities committed on his final victim. At 10:45 on the 9th of November, Thomas Bowyer knocked on the door of Mary Jane Kelly's small ground floor flat to collect past due rent. After receiving no response, he tried to open the front door, but it was locked. He then peered inside the window. What he saw was a scene from a nightmare. The wall behind the bed was spattered with blood. On the bedside table was a pile of bloody meat, and on the bed lay the virtually skinned, unrecognisable remains of Mary Jane Kelly. When the police arrived, they instructed John McCarthy, the landlord of the building, to break open the door with an axe. The scenes inside, which they'd only had a glimpse at before, would haunt them forever. What remained of Mary Jane Kelly was not just in the bed, but all around the room. The pieces of meat piled on the bedside table was the flesh of her thighs, one of which had been skinned to the bone, and her face had been practically removed. The killer had opened her abdominal cavity and removed every one of her organs and placed them under and around the body. Her uterus and kidney were placed under her head. Her liver was placed between her feet. The intestine to the right of the body, the spleen to the left of the body. Both breasts had been removed. One was placed under her head, along with the uterus and kidney, and the other one was by her right foot. Her heart was completely missing, presumably taken by the killer. Without having to worry about being interrupted by the police or passers-by, Jack the Ripper was free to carry out his murderous and depraved fantasies. Following the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, Jack the Ripper was never heard from again, nor was there another murder attributed to him. It's possible that Mary Jane Kelly may have been stalked and selected by Jack the Ripper from the beginning, and that every prior murder was a sort of dressed rehearsal for his murderous finale. It seems a remarkable coincidence that the woman he'd selected for his final and most brutal murder also happened to lead him straight into her home, particularly when every previous victim led him somewhere outside, which carried a risk of him being interrupted as he experienced on the night of the double event. He must have known before the murder that Mary Jane Kelly would have allowed him into her home. This suggests this is a killer who carefully selected his victims and planned his murders. It was over a month between the double events and the final murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the longest stretch of time between murders, and ample time to observe and select the perfect victim for his grim encore. In addition to the mystery of the identity of who Jack the Ripper was, there remains a question over how he was able to kill without being seen or heard, while removing organs in a fraction of the time it would take the best trained surgeons of the day. The sudden disappearance of Jack the Ripper following his final murder only adds to the intrigue of the case, and in the absence of hard evidence, hundreds of theories and suspects have been put forward, but never conclusively proven. Could it be that Jack the Ripper was the embodiment of something so evil that it was more than human? For now though, who or whatever Jack the Ripper was is likely to remain unexplained. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share and subscribe. It makes such a difference to small channels like these. We upload twice a week, so that way you won't miss any upcoming episodes. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening.